This is one of my favorite paintings for beginners, and in this one we can actually focus on a ton of skills. We'll explore a practical use for lifting. We're also going to be talking about layering, gradients, and even exploring a phenomenon called atmospheric perspective that will help us to create depth in painting. Now in the book there's already a pad of paper with this pre-printed, and then you'll also be able to trace that onto other paper. But if you're struggling with this, some of these techniques are actually easier when done in a smaller scale. I'm going to take a step back and show you that working at a smaller scale might actually help you to succeed a little bit easier. Plus, working at a smaller scale, especially when you're getting started, it can help you save on paper. I can turn this one sheet of paper into like 4 different pieces that I can paint on. Cut this down to 4x6 because that's a nice small piece that's going to be manageable to work with. The other thing that's going to differ from the book is that we're not going to draw any of the outlines, because sometimes you don't want the outlines, sometimes you don't want to be able to see the pencil marks under the paint. And there are certain paintings that are actually easy to get a good amount of success with without having to pre-plan and pre-sketch. This is one of them. We're going to be using quite a bit of water and color in this one, so I want to actually start by taping this down so it doesn't warp too much. For this tutorial, you're going to need lots of water. I have water in my cups here for washing my brush, but I'm also going to use a spray bottle to help me actually mix up my colors. Speaking of which, we're going to be using 3 colors for this tutorial: a Prussian blue, a Payne's gray, and a quinacridone magenta. You're going to want to mix up your colors in something that actually has quite a bit of space so that we have enough to cover the page. I'm going to be using one of these muffin tin mixing wells. I probably don't need quite that much for this size, but if you wanted to work larger scale like in the book, you're going to definitely need to fill up one of these about at least 1/3 of the way to be able to cover the sky area with enough of the color. I am using tube paints in this one, so I've pre-squeezed a little bit of each of those colors on one of the side walls of this. I'm going to spray a little water in one of these wells. Then I'm going to take a clean brush and I'm going to pick up a little bit of that blue with my brush and I'm going to mix it in to that well. A tester strip is going to come in super handy at this point, because notice that when we mix that in, that's going to look super duper dark. But if we actually test this on the paper, that's a pretty light color. And as it dries, the watercolor is going to lighten even more than when it's wet. And for the first layer of this painting, we're going to be creating some elements with lifting, so trying to showcase the white paper below it. And for that to actually work, we're going to need this color to be a little bit darker so we have enough contrast to be able to actually see it. I'm going to grab a little more of that blue and mix it really thoroughly into this. Again, I'm going to test. Still needs to be a little bit darker. I'm going to repeat that until I get to a color that is about like this, where I think there's going to be enough contrast to really showcase the clouds that we're going to be creating and have them show up against the blue color. Before we start painting our sky, we need a crucial element, a paper towel. And I recommend preparing the paper towel in a specific way. We're going to take it and we're going to scrunch it up. Then we're going to tear it. This is going to be our implement for actually lifting out the clouds. And by tearing it, we've created this kind of natural edge to it that's going to actually help us give softer edges and more cloud-like shapes than if we were to just use the textured side of this paper towel, which would give us the texture of the paper towel. We want our sky to actually go all the way down to the bottom of this painting, because if we stopped the sky about where we thought the mountains were going to be, we'd end up seeing the line where we stopped through all the other layers, because watercolor is a transparent medium. And for creating the sky, we need the preparation that we've done, we need our color, we need some water, we need to be a little quick, and we also need gravity. So we don't want to work with this flat down. We actually want to hold this at about a 45-degree angle. We're going to fill up our brush with our blue color that we just mixed up, and holding our paper at an angle, we're going to make a stripe across the top. Refilling our brush, make a stripe across the top. We're creating a wash in what is called a drip line technique. Notice that as we hold it, we actually get a little bit of a drip line. I'm going to refill my brush with that color, make another stripe. Maybe 1 or 2 more, just like that. Typically when you look at the sky, you're going to notice that it's darker at the top, lighter towards the horizon. So instead of constantly dipping into that blue, a little ways down, I'm going to start to dip into some water so we get a little bit of a gradient. Refilling my brush, I'd rather have too much at the bottom than not enough. We want to work kind of quickly on this, and once we do get to the bottom, we want to dry our brush off and quickly just grab some of that excess water. Before it dries, we want to take one of our natural edges of this paper towel, and we're just going to press and lift, rotating just a bit. If your paper towel gets saturated on the edge, you can always just tear a little bit more of that off. Press and lift to get nice fluffy clouds. If you want high wind clouds instead of fluffy clouds, you could always just take this and slide it across the page to get that effect. Worst case scenario, you did not do that fast enough and it's too dry to actually lift anything off. We're gonna take our brush, wash it, and keep it a little damp. Then we're going to just kind of lightly scrub on the page in the areas where we're hoping to be able to take off more color. Once we've added that on there, we're going to go back to lifting. I want you to keep in mind with this painting, every single sky is going to turn out a little different. So yours is probably not going to look like mine. Mine is not going to look like yours. But at this stage, you might be thinking, I can still barely see my clouds. And that's kind of the case for me because the color I used was actually a little bit too light. It's okay, we don't need to panic. We can actually kind of modify this a bit to help them stand out a bit more. But first, we need to either let this dry or make it dry. Once it's dry, you might like it as it is, and you can continue on to another stage of this painting. But if you're still kind of not convinced about the sky, we can actually add a second layer onto this that will help things stand out a little bit more. Even by layering the exact same color on top, it's going to darken that initial color because we're layering another color on a color, even if it's the same one, but it's going to increase the saturation. If your color was way too light, you could always darken it a bit now. But I'm going to do the same exact treatment where I hold my paper at an angle, fill it with that blue color a few different times and make these strokes across. And then I am going to start filling my brush little by little without fully washing it with some water to create that gradient effect. I'm trying to work a little quicker on this one so that I'll actually be able to lift out those clouds. Because I've darkened the color, there's more contrast, so those clouds are going to pop out a little bit better. Again, we need to let this layer dry or make it dry. With our sky done, it's now time to move on to the mountains. I'm going to spray some more water in one of these wells. We're going to be painting these mountains in layers, taking advantage of something called atmospheric perspective. And that is which things that are further away when you're looking at them are going to be lighter in color, a little bit cooler, and also a little more out of focus. We're not going to make ours out of focus specifically, but we're going to treat them as if they are kind of like a hint to a mountain range in the background. I'm going to take a clean brush, and I'm going to grab a little Payne's Gray, I'm going to grab a little of that Prussian Blue, and mix that into the water. I'm going to take my tester strip and make a little stripe across. Now, technically, if I were to place this color on top of this one, we'd be able to kind of see it, but I want this color to be a tiny bit darker than the color I used for the sky. So I need to add a little more gray and a little more blue. When you're mixing up a color, I like to think of it as sneaking up on the color. So add a little bit to the color at a time, mix it really well, and test until you get to the color that you want. Something like this. If you're painting in the book, you're just going to want to follow the outlines that are there. But if you've accepted the challenge to paint this smaller and without an outline, now we get to kind of go off book. We can actually look at the shapes that our clouds are giving us, and we can kind of use them to inform the shapes of the mountains. I'm going to kind of use the bottom areas of where the clouds are to help me create the shapes of the top of the mountains. Just filling my brush up with that gray color we made and making the top line of this across. I'm going to add a little bit more to kind of even this out. And then I'm actually going to put quite a bit of water into my brush, and I'm going to create a gradient down all the way to the bottom of the page. When I get to the very bottom, I'm always tapping my brush off to dry it and grabbing any excess standing water. And we'll have our first layer of mountains. And we need to let this dry or make it dry. Once it's dry, it's time to get ready to paint the second layer of mountains. This layer, because it's a little bit closer to us, is going to be a little bit darker. It's also going to be a tiny bit warmer. I'm going to use the color I mixed up previously as the base of this. I'm just going to add in a little bit more of the Payne's Gray and a tiny bit of the quinacridone magenta. We want this color to be a little bit darker than the previous one and just a tiny bit warmer. Something like that will be great. And we're going to do the same treatment where we're going to make that top layer of the mountains, adding that color in, evening out the bottom just a bit, then putting a decent amount of water in our brush and pulling it down all the way to the bottom of the page, letting it dry or making it dry. Now, you might have guessed the next steps from this because this is kind of a choose your own adventure. You could keep it here. You could add another layer. You could add 7 more layers. But all we're going to do every time we add a layer is we're going to warm it up. Now just keep in mind that the pink is kind of our warmer color. That's what we're adding a little bit of, plus we're adding a little bit of that Payne's Gray to make it a little bit darker, and then we're also warming it up a bit. So every time I'm just modifying that base mountain color with a little more Payne's Gray and a little bit more of that quinacridone magenta. It should be a little bit darker than the previous layer. And again, making that top stripe, evening it out a little bit, putting a bunch of water in our brush and softening it down, letting it dry or making it dry. And you get to choose when to stop. I'm going to add in 1 more layer. So I'm going to make this color a little bit darker, a little bit warmer, and then letting it dry or making it dry for a final time. Every single one of these paintings will turn out a little bit different, and I think that is so fun. I highly recommend trying this in a smaller format and also without the pre-drawn outlines to see what you can do.